happy and delighted to be here today. Today is a very special meeting. It's a collaboration. This CJAN is a collaboration with CSOSA, the Office of the U.S. Attorney, also Healing Communities USA. And we're going to start a conversation about women's on diversity and inclusion. And we're going to have Wendy. Thank you very much for joining us today. And I would like to give a special thank you to Denise Adams, who is my partner in the 4th District, that we together and Dr. Strothers put this special presentation for all of you today.
Good afternoon. My name is Denise Adams, and I work at the United States Attorney's Office for the 2nd District and the 4th District.
So I have 2 tasks today. My first task is an honor to introduce Dr. Grace Henry. And I've also been asked to give a few words, a little about myself on this occasion of Women's History Month. And first, we all have to be proud today, because today at Congress, we have an African-American woman who's about to step into history. So let's just get started by just giving us, all women, a round of applause, because we are making such strides, right? And speaking of strides, I am thinking about what I would say in my comments, and thinks about some of the personal strides that I have made. And if I could just share a little bit about myself, and I'm going to start all the way back to when I was born. And my mom tells my birth story. And when she tells my birth story, she always says that she was worried, because my parents, when I was born, they lived on a street called Pitts Place. And Pitts Place is a street in Southeast Washington. And at that time, it was the Pitts. It had crime, it had rat infestation, it had, roaches. It was the Pitts Place. And my mother, as a young woman, couldn't imagine bringing her little baby girl to that space. But, one of the things that marks my life is that I never had no money, and my family never had no money. We were just, lack of a better word, we were just poor. And often I look at the blessing of my life and look at how things turned out. One of the things that my mom did that made me who I am today is that she was a character builder. And she built a character in me and my siblings that changed us from kids who were coming from Pitts Place to coming to do great things. And there's 3 words that she instilled in me that I'd like to share with you all today, and leading into Dr. Henry's introduction. So there are 3 words that she instilled me with. The first was faith, because faith, it would move you forward when you don't want to move forward and when the odds are against you. Hope, because everybody gets in trouble. We all, sometimes things are not working out, and hope is what sustains you when obstacles arise. And 3, charity, because charity is what obligates you to go back to your community and help somebody else along the way. Now, Dr. King said that faith is taking the first step even when you don't see the whole staircase. And when I was a junior in college, I wanted to be a lawyer. But again, I knew I had no money. My family had no money. Actually, everybody who I knew had no money. And not only did we not have no money, people were like, girl, why are you trying to get a bachelor's degree? You think you're cute. You're trying to get this extra degree. You don't need no lawyer degree. You already got your bachelor's. However, I had worked hard in undergrad, and I still wanted to be a successful lawyer. But what happened was faith and hard work, faith. And what happened, because I moved out on faith, I wound up getting 2 scholarships to law school, just on faith alone. And so sometimes you get stuck, you want to stay on that first staircase, but just move on out, take that first step and see what's going to happen in your life, right? Because faith always brings good things, but you got to try. You can't stay stuck. And the most important thing is hope. Now, some people are on the first step of life, people like me on the 150 step of life, and hope is something that we always need when obstacles arise. And the symbol for hope is an anchor. And the reason why the anchor is the symbol, because when a ship goes out on the sea, It has a particular destination. And then when the ship is on the way to this destination, sometimes skies get stormy, they get blue, the storms get really rough, and it looks like the ship is going to tip over. But what happens is that the captain throws out his anchor, because the anchor's job is to steady the ship, right? And once the storm is over, he lifts up the ankle and then you can go on your journey. So hope is an anchor that gives you the moment to calm down in the midst of your troubles, right? So when you put your anchor down, it gives you time to think, gives you time to resolve, and it gives time for you to figure out your plan. And then again, another thing that I had to do when I was in college, I lost my scholarship. I was a musician, and I lost my music scholarship because I changed my major. And so, as y'all heard me say, the theme of this thing is I didn't have no money. Nobody I knew had any money. That should be the name of this speech. Nobody had any money. And so since I was on a scholarship, I had to figure out, well, how am I going to finish this little bachelor's degree, right? And so what happened is I had to go to school part-time and go to work full-time. Now, it normally takes most people to get their degrees in 4. It took me 6, but that's okay. Because during that time when I was figuring things out, I put my anchor of hope out so I can think things through and move forward. And so again, hope is very important when you have to anchor yourself to be able to move forward when obstacles and when storms come through. And the most important thing is charity. And one of my mother's very famous things to say to me, Wendy, it ain't all about you. Because when you're a teenager, you start thinking everything's about you. You want everything. And my mother used to say, it's not all about you. And one of the things that I've learned and that I've dedicated myself to is that whatever success I get, whether I'm a lawyer, I'm a manager in one of the largest U.S. Attorney's office, none of that means anything unless I can help somebody else along their way. And so what charity really means is helping the other person, helping our communities. We have a lot of trouble in our communities. African-American communities, Hispanic communities, marginalized communities. It is a rough time. Crime is up, violence is up, and we need a lot of help. And especially our children. Our children are in trouble. They need our hands, they need our help. And that's what we're talking about, charity. And we have to look at our children. We have to ask ourselves, are we a village that's raising our children? There's a local imam who once said to me, when there's something wrong with the children, there's something wrong with the village. So today, as we listen to Dr. Grace Henry, let's listen to her wise words and ask ourselves, what do each and one of us need to do to be the village that helps and better our communities? And with that, I have the honor of introducing Dr. Grace Henry. Dr. Grace Henry, Doctor of Education, is the Assistant Dean of Diversity and Inclusion and the Adjunct Assistant Professor of Medicine at the School of Medicine and Health Sciences at George Washington University. Her work centers on capacity building on issues of diversity, equity, and anti-racism. Dr. Henry has worked with religious groups, national sororities, national health organizations to implement strategies that promote inclusive institutional culture through the changes in policy and practice. Dr. Henry has a bachelor's in psychology, a master's in counseling and psychology degree from Howard University, and a doctorate in higher education administration from the George Washington University. Thank you so much, Dr. Henry.
Hi, thank you so much, Wendy. I started writing notes. I wrote down the faith, hope, and the charity. And I'm going to jump right in because I know we are short on time and I want to leave you with something to think about. As well, I am a chat person, so feel free to have the conversations in the chat. Make sure it's responsible and respectful. But I was thinking about it all weekend. What did I want to talk about? We had a pre-meeting last week and I came up with this topic, generational injustice, generational trauma, and a call for systemic change. I'm going to jump in with a disclaimer. I work at GW. But today I'm in my personal professional capacity. The views and opinions are mine, do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of my employer, and I have no financial disclosures. And so with that said, I'm going to start us off with 2 years ago. And if for many of us, that was a very, very hard time. But throughout the country, things came to a head. There was a national mandate that people started to look at what was happening in our communities and saying it is time for a change. We are not putting up with it. And there were different coalitions, people from different cultures, different backgrounds, different age groups took to the streets. And not only was it a national call, but as we looked across the world, it was an international call for a change in the communities in America. And so now we're in 2022. These things are now in our rearview mirror. And I want us to go into this discussion thinking about a 2-word question that my dissertation chair would ask me. I would walk in her office, and no matter what I was talking about, I would talk for 5 to 10 minutes, really excited. And no matter what I said, she always asked this question: so what? Needless to say, it hurt my feelings, but it also made me ask the question. And so I asked, so what? With the marches, with the reading of books, the podcasts that we did, the social media image blackouts that we did, what has changed? How have our communities changed for the better? So what? And so today I want to take you on a quick journey of what I call the road from generational injustice, which leads to generational trauma. I'm going to take you on 4 stops before we talk about what we do. What must we do? And so the first stop is the social construction of race. So I want you to frame in your head, and you can, if you want to express yourself in the chat, you can, but really this is just to frame the discussion. Think about your earliest messages when it comes to race. And I want you to think about, where did these messages come from? Did it come from your family, maybe at dinner time? Maybe it was a community, things you saw on the outside. Maybe it was media representation. And were the messages about your race positive or negative? And I'm pushing you into a binary. I don't want neutral stances, because I argue that race is not neutral. And so were these messages positive or were they negative? And then how have your lived experiences to date, how have they been impacted by these associations linked to your race? So these are the questions that I want you to think about as we walk through and we drive down this road. And so race as a social construction. And so from a historical standpoint, when it came to race, and race was created in the 1700s, utilized in the 1700s in the United States, there were only 3 criteria: how you looked, where you lived, and your non-white ancestry. So as long as you had slave ancestors, you were assumed to be African, which was later referred to as Black, regardless of your European ancestry. And these racial designations, they were used to concentrate power and wealth and privilege in the land of whites in society at that time. Now, these differences had nothing to do with biology. So no one was walking around swabbing your cheeks. It had more to do with the history of slavery, the history of its racism, and the social, geopolitical, and economic agendas of white supremacy. And the legal racial categories, these were established based on the premise that people of non-white ancestry were different, that they were less than human, and as such were innately, intellectually, and morally inferior. So that's a historical snapshot. Let's look at what race is considered as from a contemporary standpoint. So I went to the US Census Bureau to see, when you're collecting these data, what is it all about? And so even the census says, listen, this social definition that we use of race is not an attempt to define race biologically, anthropologically, or even genetically. In fact, it's really about our national origin and our socio-cultural groups. And so why do they collect these data? And the emphasis is mine. And so they say that we collect these data to make policy decisions. We make it for civil rights. In fact, we use data to promote equal employment opportunities and to assess racial disparities in health and in environmental risks. So again, thinking about some of the messages you received first as a young kid about race, think about the contemporary utilization of race, and think of the historical creation of race, and where do those things fall? And so we're moving quickly because this can be its own series. And so let's move down the road from race to actually racism. And so I don't know how many of you guys recognize this name, but this is Carl Linnaeus. He is the father of biological classification. So if you remember, like family, order, genus, species, he told us what were the reptiles and what were the mammals. So he's known as the father of biological classification. But you know what else he's known as? The father of scientific racism. And so I often say that he ran out of plants and animals to characterize. So he said, let me work on some human beings. And so then he started to categorize humans, and even he admits it was not based on biology. So I'm sorry, he too did not have any swabs of cheeks. He looked at individuals and he grouped them, and he recognizes that he acknowledges that he grouped them based on geography. But not only did he group individuals, but he came up with characteristics. And so if you just quickly look at it, you find that the Amerinds were governed by customs, and Europeans were governed by laws. And the East Asians, he just grouped all the East Asians together. They were governed more by what they thought, and Africans were governed by impulse. And the monstrous, which are your North, South, and South Asian Indian, they were agile and faint-hearted. And I show this real quickly, again, so that we can recognize that some of the things that we think about with race were created by design. And they existed for several hundred years. And so it's by no mistake that there are things that we see today that were there at the founding of this country. And so racism became a thing through Carl Linnaeus. Typically, when we talk about racism, so many of us, we talk about the bubbles on the left. We're really talking about people's prejudices and how it is expressed between two people. However, from 2020, I would argue that organizations and institutions started to pay attention to the bubbles on the right, where there's institutional and structural racism, there's systemic racism. And for many of us, what we're seeing in our communities are as a direct result, intentional design from the institutional and systemic playing of racism. And so again, we're moving real quickly because I have about 30 minutes. So our first stop, again, was social construction of race. The second stop was racism. So let's move down the road to structural inequity. And so structural inequity is a system of privilege. So where certain groups are disadvantaged and others are advantaged. And that is the actual definition of racism when you're thinking about power, a system of power and oppression that is focused on advantaging and disadvantaging other groups. So it is a system of privilege that keeps some groups of people from obtaining the resources to better their lives. And so there's so many adverse effects of structural inequity that we see today. We see it in our residential segregation. We see it in the environmental injustice. See this in what's going on in Flint, unfair lending practices. We see this in biased policing and disproportionate sentencing and incarceration rates. The impact of crime, and the point that I want to talk about just really briefly disproportional sickness and premature death. Okay, and so, you know, a few years ago when I started in academic medicine, I started to do some research because I wanted to get a sense of, you know, what were the leading health causes, health issues in communities of color. I wanted to see, you know, is it cancer, is it heart disease? What do I need to focus on? And I was actually rather surprised when I did my research on the leading causes of death. And so I'm going to put this up here for you, just to look at it for a second, in terms of top 10 leading causes of death. And it was so, it was mind-blowing when I was looking for disease processes, and I actually saw that death by homicide and death by suicide was really, can you guys hear me? Okay. When death by homicide and death by suicide was really taking out our communities. And I made sure that I disaggregated it by gender, because so many times we think it's simply our men. And when you go back decades, we see that the men were dying death by homicide and death by suicide for several generations, several decades. But we're starting to see that with our women. From year to year, it's moving up. And so I want to make sure that while we are paying attention to our men, which for so many reasons, that is extremely important, that we're also recognizing that our women are also being impacted by the environment that's causing them to lose their lives by homicide or suicide. Real quickly, a snapshot as well. When I look at how racial and social inequity plays out, just about every factor that you can think of, our Black and our brown communities are lagging seriously behind. When you look at wealth, that first line, you see that the median household wealth for white non-Hispanic is over $100,000. When you look at Black non-Hispanic, it's barely over 6,000. When you look at our Hispanic or Latinx communities, it's right over $7,500. And on every indice on this data point, we see that the racial and social inequity continue to play out. And so we're moving further down the road. We talked about real quickly how Carl Linnaeus introduced us to the notion of race and the notion of innate inferiority and innate superiority. Racism, talking about how our institutions and our systems help to create systems of power where certain groups are advantaged and others are disadvantaged. As well, structural inequity. These are the day-to-day, real life felt experiences of racism through our processes, whether it is money, housing, education. And so to me, I bring it all together in that we start to then see the effects, the downstream effects of all of these situations in our trauma and maladaptive coping behaviors. And so real quickly, and I know that there are people on this call for whom this is your area, and so I'm just going to touch on it, and I'll let you bring the expertise in the questions and in the chat. But two thoughts as we're thinking about how do we help our communities. And so the first theoretical lens that I suggest today is racialized trauma. What is it? It is the cumulative effects. So the things that I've been talking about. So the cumulative effects of being exposed to stressful experiences of racism, either directly or indirectly. These are the repeated exposure. So the repeated exposure can cause what they believe and they've seen, our psychologists have seen as PTSD-like symptoms, which include fear and insomnia and shame and guilt. And so some trauma, racialized trauma events, living in an environment where it's heavily policed. The constant consuming of videos of BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, and people of color being killed. So every time you see one of those videos passed on, that is a racialized trauma event. Living in communities with highly visible symbols of racial oppression. So if you live in an environment where you're seeing a Confederate flag or a Confederate statue, if you are an immigrant being held in a detainment center, if you are a Native American or any of our indigenous communities that are living on reservations. Cultural erasure. So that is when you don't even hear your culture acknowledged. You know, I remember one of the first times I went to Seattle, Washington, and I went to a cultural conference. There were a lot of people of Native American descent. And I remember just thinking, this was the first time in my life coming across someone who had a direct linkage to a Native American tribe. And so that cultural erasure also is a racialized trauma event, as well as the othering. So we've heard it. Go back to your country, go back to where you're from. A second lens I want to suggest is the lens and the theory of ambiguous loss. And this is by Dr. Pauline Ross. And she says that ambiguous loss is loss that remains unclear. And this is an ongoing loss that can be either felt physically or psychologically, and it can't be clarified, it can't be cured, and it can't be fixed. So some of the discriminatory and inequitable experiences would be that ambiguous loss that you feel you can't put your finger on. And so it can be experienced in terms of bias events that you can't prove, but you very much feel. Your loss of identity. So think of all these cultures, whether it's African culture, some of Latinx cultures, Native cultures, where language was taken, where names were changed, where cultural practices were removed. A loss of a sense of control over one's life or humanity, and the loss of the ability to see the world as a safe place. And so the construction of race, the social construction of race, the lived experiences of not only interpersonal and personal racism, but our institutional and our systemic racism, which then translates into our structures, which create daily inequity. I would then argue that all these things lead us down the road to the trauma and the maladaptive coping behaviors that we're seeing members in our community involve themselves in, suffer from, deal with. And so we started with the so what. So now the question is, now what? Now that I've told you all these different things, what do we do with them? And so some things that we can do, and I started, and Wendy's a lawyer, so she can talk even more about this, but started with new legislation. The law was used to codify or to really bake in racial hierarchies and structural discrimination. And so state and federal laws with enforcement, because sometimes we get laws and they aren't enforced, those are needed to remedy the effects of a legal legacy of inequity. Advocacy, you're gonna have to build support for policies that pursue fairness and justice and equal opportunities. Don't assume that people really understand. I mean, we are all on social media. We see a lot of misinformation and disinformation that are passed by people that we think very highly of, and use different forms of advocacy. You might like emails, but I can tell you, my students, they like TikTok. That's how they do their research. And so you have to really take a multi-generational approach in your outreach. And then participate. All politics is local. We've heard this before. We have to elect both our local and national politicians who have a demonstrated record, not just the ones who promise that they're going to do something, but who have a demonstrated record of a commitment to social justice. And we need to teach communities how laws that are enacted directly impact their day-to-day lives. Many people don't really get it. They don't understand that when you elect a school board, the people to your school board, what things that are taught and are not taught to our children. Recognize the effects of trauma. Trauma shapes a person's outlook in life. It shapes your choices. We find when we do the research that trauma is correlated with disease, heart disease, diabetes. It's correlated with obesity and addiction and overall well-being. I encourage you guys, if you don't already know, to utilize the trauma-informed care approach, which uses the lens of what happened to this person instead of what's wrong with this person. And so in this approach, the pathology lies outside the person. The person isn't pathological, their experiences are. And see all people as worthy of love and support. Avoid re-traumatization. So don't ask people to continually tell their stories. And many times we do that because we're so like, man, she has a really great story. Come over here and tell someone about how you went through X, Y, Z. Don't ask people to continually retell their stories. Create environments of emotional safety and don't violate that trust. Provide individuals an opportunity to actually have a voice in their care. That it re-traumatizes communities, and you guys know this better than I do, when we go in and we assume that we know what's best for them, as if they never thought about it. Like they just needed you to come in with the answer because somehow they just never thought about some of the ideas that you're coming with. And then lastly, and I say this for my faith leaders that's on the call, reconciliation and interfaith cooperation. You know, I grew up a church girl, so I understand. You know, we were told not to talk to the Baptists. You know, we were told the Catholics didn't know Christ. You know, we really, if we're really serious about creating change in our communities, we have to create organizational relationships that leverage strengths that bring wholeness to our communities. And this is my line, and I hope you remember this. We don't have to share the same beliefs to share the same values. We can actually believe that, you know, you don't believe in jewelry, I believe in jewelry. But guess what? We have the same values. Those are my references. I wanted to make sure that I got to. These are my references. And I will stop at this point for questions, for comments, for feedback. And again, just thank you guys. I know this was its own experience. And thank you all for listening today.
Okay, guys, thank you so much for sticking with us and being a part of this. I am Dr. Denise, and I'm with Healing Communities USA, and I have been working with the Department of Justice for several years now with Wendy Polehouse, Denise, Monica Vini, and my husband and I actually got involved with the Clergy Ambassador Program, and we are very excited to be a part of that program because their whole purpose is to build trust and respect between DOJ and the community. And at my very first meeting that I attended, Attorney Kenya K. Davis gave a presentation on sex trafficking. That is significant because at the time I was accepted into the Howard University School of Divinity's doctoral program, and I was trying to decide which way I would focus my dissertation. And Attorney Davis's presentation was very impacting. She was passionate. She informed us of things that I didn't find in a book or an online article. And it was things that was happening right here in our own cities, in our own communities. But what impacted me the most was her passionate plea on how we all could get involved in making a difference. So not only did I complete my dissertation on sex trafficking, but I had the awesome opportunity to do a presentation with her, which was absolutely amazing. We did it together on sex trafficking. So the outreach that DOJ is pursuing with the church and with the community is making a remarkable difference. And so we are very excited about the collaboration, and I hope that you guys are as well about this vision of working together to make changes in the areas of domestic violence, sex trafficking, prison reentry, diversity and inclusion, youth justice, etc. Whatever is out there, we want us to work together. And as Dr. Grace just said, we all have the same values, even if we don't all have the same religious backgrounds. We have the hopes of bringing about real change in real lives and healing in our communities.
And Dr. Strothers, I can facilitate some of these questions.
Yes,
this is Magdalena Acevedo from the U.S. Attorney's Office. I'm one of the community prosecutors for the 4th District and the 5th District, as well as your link with the Clergy Ambassador Program. And so I appreciate you sharing your experience about how the programming aimed at preventing further violence and further incarceration and encouraging the faith communities to also participate in community programming, and hopefully will be a step towards improving relationships between the U.S. Attorney's Office and the community, and also hopefully bring some change that will prevent prosecutions and prevent violent crime from occurring in the first place. So there are a couple questions in the chat, and if anybody would like any additional questions, please ask them. And actually, one of the questions was from Commander Griffin about where the data came from for the homicides explained in Dr. Grace's talk, whether they're inclusive of the entire country. And Dr. Henry responded that the leading causes of death were from the 2017 CDC national data. One thing that I wanted to ask, and I think it's more for Dr. Henry and Dr. Strothers, please pipe in, is how do we walk the line of acknowledging the systematic discrimination and bias, and yet not cause people to relive their trauma?
That's a really good question. How do we, walk that line? I think it's really about asking questions. In my work environment, which I'm not representing, but in my work environment, one thing I recognize is that because I work around a lot of clinicians, they walk in with the mindset of fixing. And they just immediately start talking, they have ideas, and they have answers. And I would argue that really sitting in the space of holding space for someone else's story, letting them lead the way, letting them talk, letting them guide. One of the points I said, getting people along the ride in terms of identifying how you will care for them and not just assuming that. So many times people don't, at least when they meet you, they're not expecting you to give them answers, because again, it almost assumes that they're not intellectually enough or emotionally intelligent enough to have come up with some thoughts as well. How do I make my life better? And so it comes off as if you already know. And I think just really being able to sit and ask questions and listen. And as simple as that sounds, have you ever sat in talking to someone and not spoken for the first 5 minutes? Most of us cannot say that we've done that, because we jump in, we have something to say, we have an answer. And I say as simple as actually listening, sitting in silence when necessary, I think begins that walking of the fine line between recognizing what happened to them, but not re-traumatizing them by insisting that they talk about it.
Yes,
Thank you.
I would like to answer that just on behalf of the church, because one of the things that we teach with Healing Communities is learning how to get in the trenches with the person. And it's very much of what Dr. Grace is saying, but we always say that people do not care about how much you know until they know how much you care. And we had this one church that this young man was a returning citizen. He said that he needed someone to help him find a job. So they had an old car that they fixed up for this gentleman, and they gave it to him. And he took the car and left and didn't have anything else to do with them. So they asked us, what happened? What did we do wrong? Why was he not thankful that we provided a way for him to finding a job, make it easier? And so our national director asked them, well, what was his name? And they couldn't tell him. So they really did not take the time out to ask this young man, what is it that you're really asking of us? Do you even really want anything from us? And really what he wanted was someone to go with him, to encourage him in the process, because for a returning citizen, finding a job can be hard. So people want to know, are we, like Gracie said, listen to them. What are they saying? What are they asking for? Instead of just always trying to throw things at them to say, here you go, this will solve your problem. And so what they want really is connection.
And Dr. Strothers, since you're coming from the clergy side, I have to ask you, how do you teach people to listen instead of just preaching?
Good question, because one of the things that we do when we go into churches is that, first of all, we remind them, if you're going to have a ministry, don't just go to the jails. Start with the people in your congregation, because trust me, there are people in your congregation who have these issues. Start with them, start with the ones that's right there. And we have to teach the church about removing the stigmatization. Unfortunately, I've been in church all my life, like Dr. Grace would say, and we can be some judgmental people. So we have to go in and really teach them. You have to remove all of that and teach the Matthew 25 principle. That God is using this as a criteria to judge how well we're serving him by how well we're serving these people. And so we have to remove that criteria and really get to the heart of the issue by getting to the heart of that person.
All right, so thank you for that. We have another question from the chat. Where and how, or do you see actual biology breaking down some of the ideas that have come from scientific racism? And if I can add on to that, I think this refers to situations such as, Black women being more endangered during labor, their children being more likely to die during labor, even, stars like Venus Williams not being believed when she had complications. How do you fight that?
Yeah. So how do you see actual biology breaking down? So biology actually supports. So there was a human genome project that was about 20 years long, and the purpose was to look at DNA sequencing of people of different races to see how different we were. And the results of that was that we were 99.98% the same. So biology already, the data and the research that shows that we are actually more the same than different actually exists. So the question really goes to when we talk about maternal mortality. When we look at it in medicine, what we say is racism, not race, is the pre-existing factor. And so many times we say that race is the pre-existing condition, but racism is the pre-existing condition. How do we know this? If you look at people who are of, for instance, African descent in different countries, you're not seeing the same thing. When you're looking at Latinx communities outside of the United States, you're not seeing the same maternal mortality numbers. And so it suggests that there's something very specific about the American experience and the American experience of race that makes it more likely that, for instance, in DC, a Black woman with the same level of education, same access to insurance and care, is 3 to 4 times more likely to die of the same stage of breast cancer than a white woman. So many times we think it is about access and we think that it is about money. And sometimes it is. But even when we dig deeper in the data, it says that it's really about how people's, whether implicit or explicit biases, interact with their patients. And so what does this look like? So I was working with an OB department, and they wanted to make sure that they were not being biased. And so we looked at national standards in terms of the amount of time from when a birthing parent requests an epidural. So from time of request to actually receiving it. And so let's say, I believe it was the average time is 7 to 8 minutes. And so they saw that, and the average time is 8 to 10 minutes. And so they looked and they saw that the Black women were getting it within 8 to 10 minutes. And so they said, oh, wow, so we're not biased. I said, well, let's look at the white mothers, the white birthing parents. And we were finding that when the average was 8 to 10, the white birthing parents were receiving epidurals in 6 to 7 minutes. And so sometimes it's not only are we at average, but who's getting the advantage? And so what happens, it's not going to be biology. It's going to be one, as I said, laws, because it being the right thing to do has never been the change, the thing that created change in our country. When you look at all the change that has happened, women getting the right to vote, women being able to own land without asking their husbands, it was never that one day someone woke up and said, you know what? I think women should be able to vote. There was advocacy, and there were laws. And so if it was just simply about proving that biologically that there was no difference, that was resolved in the 90s. That was resolved in the early 2000s in the Clinton presidential administration. It really is about power. Who has the power and who's willing to give it up? And we're living in a time where the marches that we saw, that I showed the images of, said, you know what, it's time for a change. We institutionally and structurally need to make change. But, I can't remember who says it, but who says power relents nothing without a demand. And so we have to demand for that change. And we have to recognize that there will be wins and there will be losses. But until we make changes in our laws and in our structural design, we're going to consistently see that the people who were seen as morally and intellectually inferior, we're going to continually see that generationally, that we're going to see that they are receiving the disadvantaged experience in this country.
Thank you for sharing that critical information with us. Ethan, go help her. And I'm sure we could speak for another hour and just hit the tip of the iceberg, but I do hope that the information that you have shared with us at a minimum leads people to assert their rights and question decisions are made if they don't seem right. But hopefully we'll have more conversations like this. Thank you everybody for attending, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.
I thank you all.